Welcome to the Dalí Museum. My name is Erika Schneider. I'm a master printer and visiting instructor at the University of South Florida in St. Petersburg. And we're here today to look at Dalí's prints for the show, The New Black, Dali as Printmaker. Because Salvador Dalí, most of you know as a painter, but he was an exceptional printmaker. And what I'd like to do today is start by talking about his engravings. Right here we have Famous Loves, which is a series of what's called engraving, but under engraving is also dry point. And when that means, here you see the copper plates, there's 6 of them. And what you're looking at is a direct drawing on metal, meaning that he uses things like this. This is a point, this is a roulette, and this is a burin, which is your typical tool for engraving. It has a losange tip. There's several different forms and there's several different thicknesses, but this is a standard one. This is a big enough one that you could learn with. One of the interesting things about this is it's very hard to control why in contemporary printmaking there's very few artists who still use this tool. The idea is to have it in your palm. See, this is called a pummel, right? And then you're drawing and you're pushing the copper out. And what happens is, as the copper comes out, it forms what's called a pigtail, and then you nip it. But what it does is, because of the shape, is it gives you a perfect incised V-shaped line. All right? Dry point, on the other hand, is with a point, usually tungsten, and it should be, this one's sharpened for etching, but the dry point is sharpened in a pyramid shape. And you draw as you were drawing on a piece of paper, so you're not going from the back towards the front, you're drawing normally. So where's the copper going on this? The copper comes and it sits on the top of the plate, and that's called a burr. In French, it's called la barbe, or the beard. And that makes a kind of fuzzier line. So if we look at these, here you have mostly dry point lines, for instance, and you can see that fuzz that's really pretty. It makes that kind of velvety line. Dalí got very, very good at this. But I want you to know how hard it is to master. You've got, copper's hard. It's one of the softer metals, but it's still hard to draw on. Your tool has to be spectacularly sharp, so it becomes a weapon almost. And you have to you have to learn how to draw. So if you look at this, the darker the pressure, like for instance that profile, the deeper the line, the more ink it holds, so the darker it prints. So that's the logic in printmaking. The deeper the incision marks, no matter how they're made, the more ink they will hold, therefore the darker they are on the paper. So that's how you go from light to dark. Here it was very lightly done. Here we're at all about the same value, but he's using different colors. Now that's another interesting aspect to printmaking, is that there's 2 ways to apply color. As you can see, for instance, in this plate, for this print, first it's backwards, right? So you have to draw backwards to get the front. Is that here, it's all the colors inked on the same plate and then printed, which you can imagine, and I can tell you from experience, is quite hard, especially when you get to an area like that, where there's a real separation of hand to what she's holding. Usually, and you'll see in some of the other prints of Dalí's, each color has its own plate, so you do multiple plate printmaking, all right? And that's pretty spectacular. But just to get a start, so this is directly working in the metal, drawing in the metal like if it was a piece of paper. And it gives you a certain line quality that you don't have anywhere else, And it's very, very spontaneous. Sometimes you can feel the hooks and the tension that he felt as he was drawing, because sometimes you hold, the best way to do dry point, obviously, is to hold the tool as perpendicular as possible to the plate, but artists never do that. They start to draw, and then it goes this way, this way, this way, this way, and so you can feel the tension and some of the nips that were happening as he was drawing. Now, if you don't like the burr, because you can get a really pronounced burr, and there's some examples of that later on, you'll see. If you don't like it, you can just sand down a little bit with 2,000, 2,500 grit, and the burr goes away and you're still left with a very crisp line. So as we move through these, the next part of what's called intaglio overall is etching, which we have an example here. Now, we're still using the same tools for this stuff, but this is a real interesting we're going to see a more classical etching in a little bit. But this is a more interesting approach to etching. So he took nails and hammered them into the plate to make a mark. And then he covered the plate with what's called a hard ground. It's an asphaltum-based liquid that dries hard ground. And then the artist normally draws through the ground with anything that has a point. You can even draw with this, but you're not pressing. You're just taking the ground off. And where you see the ground is where it's going to etch. What does that mean? Well, once your drawing is done through the ground, you put it in an acid bath, and the same rules apply, but differently. It's time-based now. Instead of pressing hard, it's the acid that's doing the work. So the acid bites into the virgin copper, and the longer you leave it in the acid, the deeper it bites, the more ink it will, the deeper the incision, the more ink it will hold when it's printed. And then he went so far as to bite right through the plate to make holes. All right? And this is a very unusual kind of etching because it's made with a lot of different kinds of marks, and he was a very inventive printmaker. This we're going to talk about next, but this is a lithograph. But what's interesting about this is the back of a stone that has accumulated a bunch of marks, and he just had the printer print that, and then he hand drew the figures fighting on it. So it's very nice. That's called a monoprint, meaning one print, one of a kind. And that happens a lot. When I work with artists, often we'll be doing an edition, and when the edition's done, hey, can I have the plate back? You know? And then we start doing other things with it. And we end up doing new work that leads to other work. That's what's great about printmaking is it can be a chain of events. It doesn't just have to be an object making an edition of 10 or 20 or 30 or 100 or 500. All right? So here we have intaglio. The next thing I'd like to show you is over here. This is lithography. This little room, which is great, is just to give you a little bit of process orientation. So when we go and look at the other prints, you'll kind of see what we're talking about. And here, what's really interesting is you have images, fabulous images of Salvador Dalí working. So in this image, you see he actually took a container and poured the ink on the stone to make that form. And that's interesting to me. My intermediate drawing class just did a project called Pour and Blow. How do you make marks with breath and by pouring? And it's been going on for a long time. I didn't invent that. You know what I mean? It's something that artists have been playing with for a very, very long time. So what is lithography? Well, lithography is very contrary to what you just saw because there isn't, these prints, they're matted. Actually, we can see it on the one with the holes in it. There's a plate mark that comes from the physicality of the copper. When it's inked and printed and run through the printing press, the outside of the plate leaves a mark in the paper, and that's called a plate mark. That's how you identify an intaglio print. What you have to be careful with is a lot of secondary print dealers for many years took anything and just threw a plate mark on it and called it an etching, which was where you have to be careful and know what you're looking at. This, on the other hand, lithography on stone, this is a Bavarian limestone. It's a planographic medium. You don't have that. Here the pressure is 6,000 pounds per square inch. Here, when you're printing on a hand press, it's about 2,500. But you're not printing the edges, and you're not going around it. It's really flat, so you don't have that plate mark. And the other difference is, I got to change tools here. I mean, most of you know what pencils and ink are, but in lithography, how many of you cook? There's some cooks in the house? What happens when you put oil in a glass of water? Is there any way it can mix? It's exactly what you need to know to make a lithograph. So all the marks, here he's using what's called touche, which is an India ink made of grease. It's the same thing as India ink, but it's grease-based. This is a grease pencil. Some of you know it as a China marker, but this is a litho crayon. They also make pastels. So what happens is, on a Bavarian limestone, it has a grain. Think of hills and valleys, like this. Well, the images, the marks stick to those hills and valleys. Then it's chemically prepared or etched, but not like that. It's microns. It's very, very thin. And what happens is, the non-image areas, here he's doing the blue, for instance. The non-image areas become hydrophilic, meaning loving water, hydro-waterphilic love. And the non-image areas repel the water and just want the grease. So when you go to a press, you have a roller full of ink. You sponge the stone, the non-image areas drink the water, so when the roller comes by, it says to the ink, see you later, buddy, don't want you, sorry, not home. And then the image areas say to the water, hey, get out of my way, I need that ink, I'm hungry. And that's how you print. And then each of these colors, on the other hand, unlike these, it's a different stone for each color. It's pretty intense, the registration issues and all that. So you can see here, for instance, he made those X's using corns, right? He dipped animal corns in ink and pulled. It's pretty cool. You know, once you start being inventive, you know, right now you're in the beginning stages, but when you start being inventive, you can pretty much do anything, even on paper. You know, it's just getting ideas. That's why it's so important to look at what other artists have come up with. You know, stealing is a good thing. That's how you learn. All right, let's keep going. Okay, now we're going to turn and I'm going to show you something a little strange. Yeah, and I want you to take a look at these and not look at this. Don't look at this. What does this look like to you as technique? Anybody?
Watercolor.
Watercolor. Anybody else?
Pastel.
Could be. Well, they're woodcuts. And I want to talk to you a little bit about modernist thinking and the 1920s through the 1960s in Europe, not in the United States. Artists were king. They were the kings. They were princes. And when they would walk into a print shop, printers would serve them well. And the artists were always thrilled. It was like their little posse to make good images. And this was a commission. This was one of the commissions. I don't remember how it started, but it started, there's a few of these series, and they started with one editor, and then they would run out of money and keep going. And what Dali would do, he would make these in watercolors originally. They were watercolors originally. And then they went to master carvers, because relief printing is very different than what you just saw. You take a piece of wood, and you're engraving in the wood, and then you roll the surface. So what you're digging is not what takes the ink. It's what you leave in relief that takes the ink. All right? So, but they worked in positive, meaning, you know, for instance, these blues, the wood was taken out from away from it, so the blue would stay in relief. But what's beautiful about these is the carving. Because you look at these, and I used to get this all the time. I don't do any more assessments for insurance companies, but people would show up and say, I need you to look at and give me a value for my Dali watercolor. And they'd come in, it was a woodcut. And they wouldn't believe me. And they'd go to somebody else, and by person number 3, they realized it was the truth. Because they don't look like woodcuts. And this is what the Japanese invented, is how to do wood engraving and applying ink so it looks like the original gouache or watercolor. And at this time, you had people called chromists. So a lot of these artists, Picasso included, most of them, for many, many years did not make their own prints. They walked in with a gouache or a project, and there were chromists who were color specialists and drawing specialists who would copy this and separate the colors into 5, 6, 7, 10, 12. I mean, some of Picasso, not Picasso, but Dali's work, Vasarely, there's like 30 colors, 40 colors. I used to be a chromist when I first started in Paris, and I did Vasarely's. There were 40 colors, 50 colors in lithography. And you did that because the artist just didn't want to do it, because he wanted an exact replica of what he was thinking about. Dali, after this kind of work, realized that he could work directly. You saw the dry points. But in Europe at the time, there was really a lot of both. And these were considered just as great and just as beautiful as the original work touched by the artist. Right, but I wanted you to see this because there's a lot of there's a lot of chromogenic, there's a lot of chroma stuff in the galleries as well, of other people having drawn the work. And this still works today. I mean, I'm a carver. There's 3 artists I carve for. Unfortunately, I don't say it out loud. It's illegal. Nobody wants to talk about it. But there's people I carve for and that I draw for. It still happens because they don't feel comfortable on the matrix themselves. It's just the way it is. And it's fine. I mean, I don't know. I don't think anybody feels these are not beautiful. I mean, I happen to love this whole series of work of his. And they are, if you looked at the watercolor, there's a few of the watercolors that have survived the years, and you look at them, and when you see the watercolor next to the woodcut, you see the print. But unless you have that first original one, it's hard to tell. If you don't have a trained eye, it's very, very hard to tell. All right, let's keep going into the galleries. All right, these are straight etchings. These are traditional line etchings. Now, I always get weary when I see etching after original drawing, because I say to myself, where's the drawing? I don't know if they've ever found this drawing. I've never seen this drawing. I was looking for it actually the other day. I couldn't find it. But what's interesting about that is meaning what I want to know, because when I see this, I say to myself, it looks like Dalí drew it. But usually when it says litho after original gouache, it means somebody else drew it. So when you see that, I'm kind of like, well, you know, it looks pretty good to me. I mean, it looks really interesting to me. But what's interesting about this mark making is you could almost say this looks like a dry point because of the fuzz. They left the ink in the lines. They're very, very deeply inked lines, and they didn't wipe it tight enough. They didn't print it tight enough. That's why it looks like a dry point, but it's an etching. And you can really see his plate mark very evidently. And then what's interesting about the etching, what I was saying before, is that the longer you leave it in the acid, the deeper the mark, the darker it prints. So here you have an etching that probably had 3 different bites: the lightest bite, the intermediate bite, and the darkest bite. I would probably say 15 minutes, 25 minutes, an hour was probably my estimated guess on how long that took. Right now I'm working with an artist who does really deep lines. We do 2 hour, 3 hour, 4 hour bites. So, and these are, now there's a few ways to do value. One way is to do these different bites. It's called step biting. 1, 2, 3, 4. And then another way is to put all the drawing on the image, and by making denser marks, so cross-hatching in this case, you leave it in all the same time, but you get your darker areas. So it's a one-shot etch. So there's 2 different ways to work. Here, too, we have a one-shot etch. It's just a lot denser. You see the difference between, and the line qualities. This is absolutely gorgeous. I don't know if you guys have ever seen his, when he worked directly, he was just unbelievably good. These lines are just so beautiful. Here you have a cross contour. Remember our cross contours in class? Here you got one, complete. Look at all the detail in the landscape. Same in the landscape. How he follows that form and uses the line to show perspective. They're really, really beautiful examples of etching. We're going to shift a little bit. I think we're going to do this one. These are all different. Here, this one I think is, just real quickly, this is a lithograph after original watercolor drawing. He did not draw this, for example. But it was an acceptable thing. He signed it, meaning he agreed with it. He probably added a few lines. I think that he drew the linear work. I think that there was a chromist who did the color, because that line is too close to his. You know, usually you can tell a little bit what's going on. I wanted to move to this because this is an interesting combination of process. Gala, My Sole Desire. It has a few different techniques that are really interesting. First, it's an etching with aquatint. Okay, so we're going to start talking about value in etching. And pochoir, which is the gold. Pochoir is the grandfather of silkscreen. All right, just to give you an idea. Silkscreen started with pochoir. So here you have an etching that's, there's a few plates. There's this kind of red wine color, and then this turquoise color. All right, so it's a 2-plate etching. Now, how did he do these forms? This is what I want to talk a little bit about. Well, there's a few ways you can do aquatint. First of all, aquatint is the way you get value in an etching. So think spray paint. Can you imagine, have most of you used spray paint? That spray is like a bunch of little dots that conglomerate onto a piece of paper. The closer you get, the denser it gets. The farther away you get, the sparser it gets. All right? So think of each of those little dots not being an acid resist, just like the hard ground I spoke about in etching. Well, the acid bites around those dots. That's the aquatint. So the longer you leave it in the acid, the deeper it gets and the darker it will be. All right? This is a pretty dark, this is probably about a 20-minute aquatint. These are probably the same times, but they're just different tones, you know, which is nice. Now, how did he get this drippy stuff? There's a few ways he could have done that. One is called a sugar lift, which is one of Picasso's favorite techniques. If you know the dove, if you know his print, the dove. So it's a mixture. How many scientists do I have in the group? What does a saturated solution mean? Bad in science.
It's holding as much
Yeah.
sediment or whatever.
Exactly, as much as it can. It's full. It's a full solution. So you melt sugar in water without boiling, no caramel, or you messed it up. Saturated sugar solution, you add a little bit of India ink. You wait till it cools down a little bit. You get a copper plate that's completely clean and grease-free, and you paint with the sugar solution. Step one. Takes overnight to dry. It's a little long, but it's okay. Then you cover that dried sugar solution with hard ground. That takes 2 hours to dry, all right? Then you put that whole thing in hot water. What happens? The sugar melts and it lifts, sugar lift. So these forms lift off the plate and give us back the copper. And then the aquatint is put on and then bitten in the acid bath, all right? Or we do spit biting. Now this is real interesting. In the 18th century, there was, around Hogarth, I think it was Hogarth who did it for the first time, who was a cartoonist. He was trying to paint with acid, and then he would just spit on it to stop it from biting, because of the pH, the neutral pH of saliva usually will stop the biting of the acid. Now we're obviously in the 21st century, and we're more elegant. We don't spit, but we use water to stop the bite. If you go to the Tampa Museum of Art, Miro's prints that look like they've been blown almost because they're so delicate, that's all spit bite. And I see that there's some really light values here, so I'm saying this might not be a tray bath, it might have been a spit bite. Each time I look at these, I find new things. So I think and then last but not least, the pochoir part. Now what is pochoir? It's a French word, obviously, and pochoir means a stencil that was cut out, and then the ink is applied either with a soft brush or with it's a stamp brush. There are these brushes that have these thick bristles in it. You stamp it through, and then only that form will print. And that's how they applied gold at the time, is through pochoir, often. All right? Now we're going to pass to lithography a little bit. We're going to go back and forth now, as I showed you before. This is a beautiful example of crayon work. This is called the Drawers of Memory. And now I'd like to talk to you a little bit about some of the things you're seeing here and might not understand what's going on. As you've seen in all the prints, there's a number usually and the signature of the artist. Every once in a while, you might have a title in the center. Now that's a traditional way to identify a print. 22 out of 150, that means this is number 22 out of 150 total in the edition, and the artist's name. Here on the panel, you'll see the date when it was made, original lithograph, the edition. There's 150, yep. And then there's Roman numerals, which are usually artist proofs, and that's on Japon, which was a kind of paper they would print on at this time period in Europe between the 40s and the 60s. The printer was Désjobert. Désjobert was a very famous printer at the time. He passed away before I got to Paris, but the guy who took over Désjobert at the time, Michel Maché, who had worked with Dalí, had taught me how to be a chromist. I couldn't get a job in a shop because I was a woman. They didn't want to hire me because it was a very male-dominated arena. And he was the first person to say, hey, I got something you can do. I'll just stick you in the office and you can draw. I was like, all right. And then I finally got my time on the press at one point. But the publisher was Sidney Lucas in New York. I don't know him. So a publisher is the person that pays for everything. The printer is the one who makes it. The publisher pays. So these little numbers tell you a lot about things. Now, once upon a time, starting in about the Renaissance, as the prints were being pulled off the press, the printer would number them. Because there was usually, in stone lithography, which was later on, but in the Renaissance you had etching, they had no way to harden the copper. So number 1 from number 40 looked very different. So it was always better to buy the number 1, the first 10. Actually, in a dry point, it was the first 10. But with technical advancement, people still want to buy the first numbers because it's a habit. Old habits don't die. But now we have what's called steel facing, where we put a very fine, thin film of steel on the copper, which allows us to print better prints for a longer amount of time because the copper doesn't wear down. One of the horrible things with dry point, obviously, and an untrained eye does not see it, but I see it when I'm printing dry points. If the artist doesn't want me to steel face, I cringe each time I hear the press go over the plate because with each print, it just gets crushed a little bit. And I see the difference, but a lot of collectors don't see the difference. I want to go down some more. All right, these are all lithographs here. This is also de Jobert, I figured. A lithograph. This is on a zinc plate, not on stone. And zinc was used instead of stone. Why? Well, a little stone like this is 30 pounds, 40 pounds. You really want to be carrying that in your backpack? You know, plus they're fragile, rare, expensive. So they started working on zinc plates, which rendered the same kind of beautiful line quality that stones did. It was a lot more work and much more difficult to print, but they figured it out. And so the artists, they would deliver the plates to the artist's studio. The artist could draw, and there was no problem with that. So you can take a look at these. This is a zinc plate. This is on a different French printer, Merlot. Here we talk about dry point. I'll just go real quick on this. Lady Godiva. This is a dry point. Look at how beautiful that line is, the difference of the values. Look at that. See, there you have your burr. Now, on the lighter lines, the burr is not that evident because you're not really displacing copper that much. But he was just so good at the spontaneous work. You know, these lines are just fabulous. Here's an example. This is a color lithograph after original gouache. You know, it's interesting. You know, he signed this, but it doesn't look like his work. I think that the chromist didn't get it. You know, and that's part. I mean, that happens. I worked when I was in France. When I started printing, I had 5 chromists in the shop I worked with, and depending on who the artist was that needed the chrome work done, I would pick the chromist I wanted because I knew that this guy could understand what the artist wanted, but this other person could not, and it wouldn't be good. An artist that really used chromist a lot was Brown van Velde, who was a Dutch painter who lived in Paris between 1940 and 1970. And when you look at his work, you really got to go through it because there's great pieces, and then there are pieces that don't look at all like his painting because whoever was drawing didn't really understand the soul of the work. All right, speaking of that, I wanted to move to this series because it's a fabulous example of what an artist like Salvador Dalí can take away from the print media, I think. I love this series of work. I think it's one of the things I'd like to have of his if I had a choice. This is called The Conquest of the Cosmos, and it's dry point etchings that are printed on chromolithographs and embossed. Publisher was Jean Lavigne in Paris. The printer was Bellini. The edition was 195 on Arches paper with a whole different edition of, I can't read Roman numerals anymore, on Reeves BFK. And then another 195 proofs on Arches and Reeves. There's a lot. And this was one of the things, at this time period, we didn't have the control on the print market that we do now. You know, for instance, now the educated print dealer, the print collector is going to ask you, how many are in the edition? Are there secondary editions, tertiary editions? You know, work like this that was printed, you know, Alachinsky did it, they all did it. The Cobra guys did it. Picasso did it. So that was very common at this time period. But what's fabulous in these prints and to look at is the use of color and the use of what's called embossment. You see how some of these things are, you can really see the volume in it. Up there, here's the embossment. Now, so how does this work? Dalí did all the dry points, and I think he did the dry points first. And then they tapered and catered, the technicians and the printers tapered and catered the colors to his work. Because a dry point is printed wet, chromolithography is printed dry, and embossment is printed either wet or dry, depending. So already you have a difference in paper size, a difference in surface. So what's interesting to see, so what's chromolithography is that means that there's someone working with Dalí who's separating the colors for him and getting them to sit exactly where he wants. Now, I don't know what the embossment was made, how the embossment was made. So let's talk about what it is. Let's see if there's a form here that's pretty obvious. Something that's a little obvious to see. Well, yeah, here you have like piece-shaped embossment. Here you have the butterflies. Here we go. The butterflies are embossed. All right? So how's that done? Well, the first thing would be to print the color because the color's flat. You don't have to set up, you don't have to wet the paper, you don't have to do anything. So the color's printed first. Then the dry point is printed, so that has to be wet. So if the chromist did his job, that means when the paper's wet and it's stretching, the dry point fits exactly where it should. I pull my hat off to the people that did this because they were exceptional. This is very hard to do. And then, what is an embossment? An embossment is a print without ink. It's just the volume. So you can do it in linoleum. You can do an embossment out of wood. You can etch a copper plate very deep and do an embossment in copper. You can do an embossment in aluminum. This, I think, seeing that it goes this way and not this way, was either printed from the back, which is possible, and some kind of putty. I'm not sure, I have never seen the plates to this, so I have no idea how it's done. But since it's coming out, I'm thinking that it's either printed from the back, or it was done with something soft, because there really aren't that many creases. Well, there's some little creases in the paper, because it's very hard. It really stretches the paper. But it's not inked. So you have to have the ink on before, and then the embossment happens at a second time. Louise Nevelson is very famous for her embossed etchings. She would etch, they would print it without ink. And then you'd have all the levels like in her sculpture. All right, so you can do that as well. But this is really a beautiful example of a mixed media print. And then, if you really, you have to be OCD. You do in printmaking, to say the least. You really do. You have to be really on it. You have to figure it out. You have to be focused and attentive, but it's nothing that's impossible. I tell my students this every day. I mean, I'm very admirative because I've worked on projects like this, and I know how much blood, sweat, and tears goes into something like this. Because you work for hours, you do the first proof, and it doesn't line up. And you're pretty sure yourself that it was going to line up, and it didn't. And then you have to, tweak it and figure out how to make it line up. And you always have, and it's a repetitive gesture. They did, 400 prints like this. Getting them to all look pretty close is pretty marvelous. And what the interesting thing is, what the chromists were good at, and this is why I tip my hat off to them, is they could make in print things look like it was painted. Artists never had the patience to do this stuff. They still don't. I work with contemporary artists all the time, and I end up having to do stuff because they won't do it. Oh, that's all right. Just leave it like that. No, it's not all right. Let's not leave it like that. So it's it's just this. Artists are so used to being. One of the things about making prints is the collaboration. This is a perfect example of that collaborative effort. Is that the printer or printers and the artist in question have to understand each other. Dalí in the beginning had a really hard time in print shops because he had a bad temper and he wanted it now or yesterday. He didn't realize that it was a process and that, you had to be it's like a marriage. Like I look at it like a marriage. When I have an artist who comes into my shop, and I usually get the virgins, that's my lot in life. When I always get referred when nobody wants to work with somebody because they're difficult, so I get them. And I always find that it's, usually, and, men and women at part equal are difficult because they're used to working in their studio. They've never had a witness to failure. And so you're like their lover, their mother, and their shrink all in one. And you have to make them believe that they have the idea and it's not you. And that's how it works. And Dalí was really like, he was king, so you better not tell him anything. So the whole idea was being able to kind of almost whisper in his ear without anybody realizing it. So all of a sudden he would say, oh, I want to do this. It was his idea. So he was happy, and they knew how to treat them. When I heard, I worked with Jean Dubuffet before his death, and I worked with him for about 3 years. And one of the fabulous things, and Mehta as well, who was a contemporary of Dalí. And one of the great things I used to love about them is they had such respect for the printers that I remember the third time Dubuffet came to the shop, we were proofing one, we were doing the mirror series, and it was really hard because it was a mixture of phototypie, which is a collodion glass process, lithography, both on plate and stone, and the registration was a nightmare. And he was very patient, and I was just, I couldn't talk. He was my god, so it was like, Dubuffet. So every time he would walk in the shop, I would shake, and they would all make fun of me, And one day he comes in with a tray, and it was a coffee and a croissant for me. Just for me. This guy, for me. And I kind of looked at him and I was like, why are you bringing me coffee? That's my job. And they were just so kind. Mata was the same way. Who's hungry? Let's go. Or they would bring you things. Or, you'd be working 15, 20-hour days. They were always right there. They were in the work as much as you were. And that collaboration is really important. Otherwise, you don't get work like that. It's impossible. Because there has to be that basic, almost savage understanding of each other. And it comes with that yelling, screaming, throwing things. It's like a marriage, I'm telling you. And compromise. Absolute trust and compromise. Because if the artists don't trust me when I'm on a press, I won't do well. I need to feel that they think I can do anything they want me to do. And I need to think that I can ask them anything I need them to do. And that's a real collaboration. So all this work you see here, it wasn't Dalí alone in a place drawing. It was Dalí in a shop devoted to the act of making art. It's a beautiful thought. Sometimes it works, sometimes it doesn't. Sometimes it yields fabulous things, sometimes it doesn't. But it's a crapshoot. I tell artists when they come to my shop the first time, this is either going to work or it's not, and if it doesn't, we'll have to have a plan B, a plan C, a plan D. I worked with a printer who did a lot of Léger's prints, was my first teacher, and he said to me that Léger told him one day to stop messing around. The vocabulary was a little different, but stop messing around. If you can't get something in 4 colors, it means it's a failure. So let's go on to something else. It means it wasn't a good image to start with, which is real interesting. And if you look at Léger's prints, and I chromed a few of those. For the Museum of Biot, I drew about 20 Léger prints. There's never many colors. It was very brilliant, very, very brilliant work. And like these, there's not that much. If you think there's some little craziness and stuff like this, but if you really look at the pictorial plane, there's 2 or 3 colors that set it up, then the drawing that gives it the punch. It's really a beautiful translation of his painting, graphically. All right, then on this wall, there's a few really crispy things. Now, these are all chromous lithographs, and they're pretty good. Some are better than others. And this has embossment somewhere, and it has dry point on top, it looks like, as well. Yep, there's some etching on there. I don't really see where the embossment is, or I'm blind, but it says embossment, probably somewhere. Interesting. All right, there's one here I really wanted to show you, and I think it's towards the end. Yeah, here. This is probably one of my, personally, because I'm a real intaglio person, one of my favorite prints in the show. Because I know for sure no one else could have drawn that but the artist, first. And second, it's a fabulous use of dry point. Now, there's a little tool I didn't talk about earlier that's called a roulette. I do have one in my pocket. Yeah. All right, this is a dinky student grade roulette. I'm sorry. I ran out of the house this morning, couldn't find my big roulettes. But this is a little tool that's a magic tool for printmaking. And they come in different sizes. You can get real big ones. And they come either with a line pattern or a dot pattern. So this is how you do halftones in engraving. So here you have, this is a line roulette, which means it's a little wheel with a lot of little points. So as you go, bzzz, it makes a very equal line, and you can see that here. This is dot roulettes. This is still line roulettes. And this, I think he took a hammer and a nail and just went to town to get the rest of the constellations. So you have a very traditional, you have line drawing, which is dry point. You have roulette work, and then you have some crazy work like in the back print there, and I love that. That's Dalí for me. That's where he excelled, and that's where he's fabulous. And it's a beautiful print. There's a lot of white space. There's not a lot of color, but it's very colorful. And that's a real successful print. And then here we have 32 out of 75. So 75 examples in 5 editions, numbered 1 to 75 to 75, 75. There's 5 different types of paper in those 75. Arches, Reeves, Japon, Richard Debat, and Lana. So Arches and Reeves are your more traditional printmaking papers that everybody can get. Japon is this Japanese paper that's called nacré, which means mother of pearl in English. So it's a paper that shifts from a kind of silvery white to an egg white color. Richard de Bas is a handmade, very beautiful French paper, but very hard to print. And Lana is another traditional printmaking paper. Very good for lithography, I find. This one looks like it's Arches. Yeah, that looks like Arches has a real pronounced grain to it. All right, and last but not least, I'm going to beeline back because I forgot one that we really need to look at. I'm sorry. My linearity just got blown. I'm sorry about that. For those of you who are art history people and graphic design people, you should know this image. All right, so my art historians, don't say a word. My graphic design majors, who is this? Who is this copying? What image is that? Huh? Who said that? No. Mm-mm. Wrong time period, wrong country. All right, my art historian, who is it?
Albrecht Dürer.
Albrecht Dürer. You guys don't know Albrecht Dürer? You better know him by next week. So what's interesting about this is one of Albrecht Dürer's famous prints but no, he didn't draw it like this, is the rhinoceros. And Dalí went so far as to imitate the signature, but on top of it, he put a crown, which I love. For me, that's who Salvador Dalí was, you know? That's who Salvador Dalí was. Mehta and I, at the first one I started working with Mehta, he didn't like me because I was American, but once we started to be friends and work a lot together, he said to me, he always had trouble with Dalí, but he had to admit he got the best girl, which I always thought was funny. He was jealous of him, but they were all jealous of him because of Gala, but it was funny. But here you have it. He's homaging, a very famous artist of the 15th century, and also, just really almost laughing with him at the same time. But Dürer was a great guy because Dürer, and I'm sure Dalí admired Dürer. He might have never said it out loud, but Dürer was from a family of engravers for arms, guns and knives. The family embellished all the arms at the time, 1450s, 1480s. And one day he had the idea. He said, well, what if I took this off the gun, flattened it, and printed it? And he did one. And he went, oh my God. And so printmaking, Schongauer had been doing, his master had been doing a little bit before, but he figured out what I loved about Dürer. Dürer was the first artist, print publisher, and gallerist all in one. So he did the math. He said, a painting takes me 5 months, because at the time they did rabbit skin glue, oil painting. It took forever to dry. The conditions were never good. Transporting a big painting was always a pain in the neck. We didn't have Art Transport International at the time. And so, it was just a different time period. We didn't have photographers. So he said, well, if I print it, I could make unlimited prints, meaning I could have my work in all over the world, and I could make a lot of money. Instead of waiting to sell that one painting to that one client. And so he was really, I'm sure Salvador Dalí in one way did this because he admired him. The other thing Dalí did was he had photo printmakingly reproduced a series of Goya's prints that he then redrew on. I don't know, those were exhibited here last year, I believe. And those are beautiful. So there's very few artists he really makes homage to. So you have to say there had been something really special in it. And I think he admired that. Because Dalí, too, had trouble living at one point, and there was a Zodiac group that formed, which were 12 very rich men, the Zodiac, 12 months. And each month, one of those men would give him his living money. So they supported him relentlessly and unconditionally, which was a really exceptional thing to do, really beautiful. So I hope you enjoyed this. This is a nice world, printmaking, and one of the things that is important to understand about printmaking is it's got two main reasons to be. In the early times, it was established as a way to show off. Printmaking really started in the Renaissance with a guy named Ugo de Carpi, who was a buddy of Raphael's, and he started reproducing for the court Raphael's paintings in chiaroscuro, because Ugo de Carpi was a wood engraver, and he understood that if you use the mid-tone paper, like a gray paper as a mid-tone, and you printed white and black, you could have a full range of values, and it didn't have to be in color. So he started copying Raphael's work, and so instead of having to ship a 50-foot mural, which you couldn't ship, there wasn't, as I said, in the 16th century or 17th century, Art Transportation International didn't exist either. So the courts, the Medicis, would make prints and ship them. Hey, to the King of Spain, look what I got, look what you don't have. And this is how images got around, and it was really fabulous. And so it was a way to promote an artist's work. Then by the time we get to Dürer figures out, well, the Dürer was a little bit before, but Dürer figures out it was also a way, actually it was way before, to make money. Later on, during the Renaissance, they didn't really make money with prints. It's now we're making money with Renaissance prints, but it was a little bit later with people like Jacques Callot, I guess 1670s or 1750s. I'm sorry, I'm not an art historian. Jacques Callot? No. That he started to make very serious engravings, historical engravings of buildings, of places, of kings. And those would be purchased. People wanted those. So it became a market, all right, that was independent from, l'artiste. It was just different. And then those two merged probably, I would say, the late 19th century during the Enlightenment, when Turner was making prints and all these people started making prints because it was a way to spread your image, but also the painters realized it was a way to investigate and pull further one's thought process. For instance, as a master printer, I know that I've succeeded in what I'm doing. When I get a phone call from the artist that says to me, and I just had one, so I'm always like, I'm on cloud 9 when this happens, I won't be able to ever look at my painting again the same way I did before I met you. Thank you so much. You have brought so much to my work. I know I've done something good. Because working in print is so different, because you have a matrix, there's a displacement. You start with something, you have to print it before you really see the image. It looks like one thing on the metal or the stone. It looks different when it's printed. You have this other person to contend with, a whole other thought process to contend with, a whole other personality to contend with. I'm telling you, it's just like marriage. It's exactly the same. And you have to commit. Making a mark on copper is not like making a mark on paper. You can erase on paper, you can't erase on copper. So there's this whole idea of focus and commitment. With stone, it's the same way. So it makes you evolve in your thinking, it makes you evolve in your image making. So it is, a lot of painters work, Picasso was always in a print shop. Look at his print work. A good homework assignment for you guys is you find a painting you really like, and the same dates, see the prints he was making at the same time. Then look at a painting a year later, and you will see the difference. And you can make bridges like that. The big print Miro could not have lived without printmaking. His work would have been, he was with Mag. I worked for Mag for 10 years. So I worked on the presses Miro worked on. It was very disabling for me in the beginning. I was like, I don't know if I want to touch this. The history, the ghosts, all that. It's intense. But if you look at Miro's painting, he had a point, there was a point where he was really stagnant, and then he worked with Prévert on this fabulous etching book, a book of etchings and embossment that's so beautiful. I cry. I almost get sick when I see it. I would have wanted to have printed that. But then you see the painting after that, it just implodes with this unbelievable looseness of form and color. And that comes from having worked in the print shop. So one thing feeds to another. So that's also, for me, it's first and foremost that. The market takes care of itself, I think. I don't think you make things for them. In this time period, they made things for the market. Because as the paintings, and also as the paintings get more expensive, obviously, I'll give you, don't know what his paintings sold for in the 50s, but for instance, today, if I look at an artist like Kiki Smith, whose sculpture almost gets to $1 million right now, I can still get a print for $1,800, $2,500, $3,000. That's dealable, and I have a beautiful piece of art. You know what I mean? So prints also help young collectors buy artwork. Dalí's an interesting character for me in art history because, he was really, really good, and he was also really, really bad. And I say that with a lot of love and affection. I don't say that negatively. Because often our young people today think that, you grab a little bit of your gut and you're 100% on your game all the time. Well, you're not. And what I like about the artists of this generation, Picasso, Dalí, Miro, all of them, is that they weren't ashamed to make a bad painting. And I think we need to understand that, you know, from your weaknesses is where you gain your strengths. It's not the opposite. Because if you always work with your strengths, you'll never get any better. But if you work through your weaknesses, you'll get really good. And I think Dalí got that really quickly, but he wasn't ashamed of some of the mediocre stuff. And unfortunately, at this time period, and I can give you 100 examples of artists, because they're all there. I was Pierre Laczynski's personal assistant for a long time, and I saw a lot of bad prints. There's fabulous prints, but I saw a lot of from his early stages, you know, the chromist stuff, where it's just blah, blah, blah. And it's like repeating the same phrase over and over and over again. And they all look the same. Like this print, like I'll take this horse print, for instance. I can put that next to a Marino Marini print I just saw a couple days ago that I was expertising. It looks just the same. It looks just like it. So I'm sure it was the same Italian chromist that drew the both. I can almost guarantee you it's the same guy. And if this guy doesn't understand the difference between the mark making of Dalí and the mark making of Marini, that's tough. I mean, that's not good. So in this time period for prints, there's a lot of stuff that's pretty flat. But when it's good, it's really good. And so for Dalí, who was a master of image making, you can't deny him that, and I won't deny him that. When I see things like this, or I see those, the hand-drawn lithographs, the memory lithograph we talked about earlier, or that dry point I just spoke about, I mean, I get tingly inside. I mean, that's something for me that's fabulous to see, because I can imagine his face and his mustache when he's making those marks. I can imagine the excitement when the printer printed the first print, and I think just for that, this show's fabulous. You know? Thank you. Thanks.